Hi, everybody, and thank you, obviously, to Tori and also my fellow panelists and the Society's conference committee. So today I'm going to talk to you all about ongoing geoarchaeological and paleoethnobotanical work at the Jaketown site in the lower Mississippi Delta region of, in the Mississippi Delta region of the lower Mississippi Valley. So Tori, slide switch. Perfect, thank you. So my collaborators and I are currently focused on a period 4,000 years ago down there, when Native people built earthworks at the Jaketown and Poverty Point sites indicated on the map there, in association with what archaeologists call the late archaic Poverty Point cultural phenomenon, which is this time of unprecedented aggregation, exchange, and monumental construction in the lower Mississippi Valley. The people of Poverty Point and associated sites are sort of famous in the anthropological literature for defying once orthodox models of cultural evolution, as these people living in the LMV at this time constructed a society responsible for complex architecture and exchange systems unrivaled in scale or elaboration for millennia in Eastern North America. And all of this occurred according to available data, in the absence of domestic-based agriculture or institutionalized hierarchy. Next slide. Thanks. So, looking beyond the lower Mississippi Valley for just a second, I think that our work at Jaketown has something to say about the theoretical framework of historical ecology, which has been so useful in analyzing human environmental interactions over the past decades and is an underpinning of a lot of the work of folks in this society. So the places where historical ecology as a research program have really developed in the Americas, have been the Northwest Coast and Amazonia. And these places have a couple similarities. So both places have historically and currently cultural diversity. It's been well documented oral and ethnographic records and continued practice of hunting and gathering. So oral and ethnographic records of hunting and gathering and continued practice. And also intact forests, fragmented, yes, but intact, that encode deep time human environmental relationships through, the hyperdominance of useful species and other indicators. But in the Mississippi Delta, like many places in the Americas, landscape and cultural continuities bridging the European contexts that are colonial from indigenous past divide are largely obscured. Next slide. Oh, next slide, Tori. Thank you. Okay, so why, in contrast, to like Amazonia and the Pacific Northwest, why am I saying that the lower Mississippi Valley, the United States, is not a legacy ecology? And what does this mean in terms of understanding socio-ecological relationships in the past? So as represented kind of roughly by the schematic here, so going from the pre-inhabited Delta landscape, represented on the left from a couple forest sites near Jaketown in Mississippi. So going from pre-inhabited landscape through native land use starting at least 10,000 years ago, with, as represented by the rendering there of the landscape at Poverty Point, again, the Poverty Point era, around 4,000 years ago. This is, and then leading up to European contact, a rich indigenous history, but in part due to its impenetrable subtropical alluvial forest at the time, the Mississippi Delta was settled by Euro-Americans relatively late. Explored, yes, passed by DeSoto, but in terms of like land grab by Europeans, so the Choctaw held the Delta region until shortly after Mississippi became a state in 1817. From 1820 to 1832, white settlers removed the Choctaw and other tribes in a series of treaties. And then after removal, the white plantation owners drained the Yazoo Basin, so drained the Mississippi Delta region which was once dense forest. So this occurred using, the labor of enslaved Africans and indigenous people to clear the land of, vegetation, to drain, and to build levees to control the Mississippi and its tributaries. So, as kind of again represented by progression, there this plantation agriculture gave way to industrialized production. Today, we see heavy use of machinery and pesticides in the Delta, leading to the kind of landscape represented there at a shot from the Jaketown site from a couple summers ago. So just briefly to clarify, I'm not saying all indigenous culture in the lower Mississippi Valley has been lost, because that would be incorrect. Groups of Choctaw and other tribes have stayed in the Delta region specifically, including 2 groups with state recognition. But the widespread ecological markers of the pre-contact society have been largely removed via, again, plantation and then industrialized agriculture. Okay, next slide. Thanks. So back to Jaketown. So in the absence of legacy ecologies in the lower Mississippi Valley, what do we have? So we have to start thinking socially to understand the unique human-environment relationships that allowed the people of Jaketown and Poverty Point, to build monuments in what was eventually a swamp at the time. So next slide. Thanks. So to do so at Jaketown, my collaborators and I have turned to looking at plants and earthworks as proxies for these social relationships in the absence of legacy ecologies. And in my research so far of the paleoethnobotanical assemblages from Jaketown, I'm seeing beyond a system, of relationships with like single plants. Of course, it seems as if, like other regions like Amazonia, we know that this was likely a whole complex system. So again, in my what I have from the LMV, though, these relationships are preserved just in charred plant remains. So images on the slides of the different contexts where we've collected flotation samples at the Jaketown site, including mound fill. And then if you could click through, Tori, to the next one. More mound fill, and then next one. And a couple middens. We have a consistent assemblage of persimmon, pecan, and goosefoot showing up in kind of definitely overrepresented in a very limited species range. Next slide. So I'm going to run through a couple examples of what we can find out by from these charred plant remains from the archaeology of the earthworks at Jaketown. These proxies for the social meaning of socio-ecological proxies. So, as this is just a presentation of the ubiquity of taxa in flotation samples from Jaketown, Poverty Point, and another contemporary associated site. And what I'm seeing, as you can kind of tell, Jaketown is represented by the black bar there. Compared to the other sites, there's more persimmon and pecan being regularly, processed and left behind in cooking fires and in middens at Jaketown compared to other sites, compared to Jaketown to Poverty Point or the other site, the Cope site. It's included there on the map. So this, in terms of, we could say maybe background ecology of these sites is different, but the amount that I'm kind of like seeing this differentiation again in like hyper focus on persimmon and etc. Heard it is I'm thinking that there's a particular kind of like practice and specialization occurring at Jaketown compared to other sites. So next slide. These are plans of the earth and architecture at Jaketown and Poverty Point, which is in both cases a series of mounds and ridges. And in their form, they can be read as perhaps mimicking or conversing with the natural alluvial landscape of the LMV, which is characterized by meander scars and oxbows, again, indicating a particular kind of socio-ecological relationship and knowledge system through just these earthworks. Next slide. Finally, by sourcing some of the non-local rock and mineral imports identified at Jaketown and Poverty Point, we know that people maintained widespread social relationships across Eastern North America at this time, at the end of the late Archaic. And some of the places linked to the lower Mississippi Valley by exchange include early sites of plant domestication. So due to particular relationships with people, plants that later came to be part of what's known as the Eastern Agricultural Complex in Eastern North America, including goosefoot, Chenopodium subspecies, Chenopodium berlandieri. So goosefoot at contemporary, again at this period of time, began to display morphological changes that archaeobotanists associate with domestication. So people in the LMV, however, as indicated by the assemblages from Jaketown, continued to harvest wild goosefoot, right, despite these linkages with areas where domestication and horticulture were becoming common practice. Again, this is an indication of a social relationship and a kind of peek into like culture, cultural conservation and formation. So just end by returning to think about historical ecology as a framework in this sense. Yes, thank you. Next slide. Yeah. So, right. So if we think about palimpsests as recorded somewhere like Amazonia or the Pacific Northwest in legacy ecologies, it's not an explanation of a process for seeing a palimpsest as, a result of accumulation. So in the LMV, where palimpsests have been truncated, the social side of these processes becomes all the more essential to understand the diversity of forms of socio-ecological relationships in the past. And before my closing slide, there were a couple images of like little resurgences of forest and marshland at the margins of at the margins of industrialized fields near the Jaketown and Poverty Point sites. And these are places where we can maybe get glimpses of the places that late archaic people might have known, right? And we're continuing to learn how they might have incorporated these places into their social world through archaeological proxies. So that is it. On the close, I'd like to thank my collaborators. It's a very, archaeology is inherently collaborative, so there's been a lot of people involved. And thank you to them all. And thank you, Tori and panelists and audience.